Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even though you were completely alone? Imagine stepping onto a ship where that eerie sensation never leaves you, no matter where you go. Welcome to the Queen Mary, the most haunted ship in the world. I know, I didn't believe in ghosts either. At least, not until I set foot on that ship myself. My name's Mark, and what I'm about to tell you is no Hollywood script. It's real, too real. It all started when my friends and I decided to explore something unusual. We were thrill seekers, Andrew, Katie, and myself. We'd heard all the stories about Queen Mary, but we were skeptics. You know, the kind of people who roll their eyes at ghost tours. So when we booked a trip to visit the famous ship docked in Long Beach, California, we expected nothing more than cheap scares and exaggerated stories. We couldn't have been more wrong. The ship itself is a marvel, an enormous ocean liner from the 1930s that had been through World War II, carrying thousands of soldiers. Now it's a floating hotel and tourist attraction, but what really caught our attention wasn't its history. It was the ghost stories, reports of phantom footsteps, doors slamming on their own, and ghostly figures seen wandering its long, narrow hallways. And of course there was the infamous Lady in White, the spirit of a woman who, as legend has it, roams the ballroom, forever dancing to music only she can hear. We checked in, ready for a night of laughs and spooky stories, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. And it all started the moment we stepped into our room. It was colder than we expected, much colder. And not just the typical old ship kind of cold. It was the kind of cold that makes your skin prickle, like someone's breathing down your neck. Andrew, always the skeptic, chuckled. Guess they don't believe in heaters on ghost ships, huh? But Katie? She wasn't laughing. She stood by the window, staring out into the ocean, pale as a sheet. "Guys, did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" I asked, glancing around. "I swear, there was someone outside, just standing there, on the deck." Andrew rolled his eyes. "It's probably just another guest. Relax, Katie." But something in her voice made me uneasy. I walked over to the window, looked out, and saw nothing, no one. "See?" I said, trying to sound confident, though the knot in my stomach told me something wasn't right. Katie backed away from the window, her eyes wide. "Mark, I know what I saw." Now here's where things start getting weird, and I need you to pay attention, because what I'm about to tell you still gives me chills to this day. That night, we all went to bed, laughing off the strange vibe in the room. Around 3 a.m., the time when they say the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest, I woke up. Not because of a noise, but because of the absence of one. The ship was too quiet, almost like the air had been sucked out of the room. I glanced over at Andrew and Katie. They were fast asleep. But then I heard it, faint at first, like distant humming, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, coming from the hallway. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then the sound grew louder, closer, as if whoever was humming was right outside our door. I slowly got out of bed, heart pounding in my chest, and crept toward the door. The humming stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, debating whether I should open it or not. But before I could decide, the doorknob started to turn on its own. Slowly, I jumped back, my heart racing. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit hallway, and nothing else. No one was there. I stepped out, peering into the long, empty corridor. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a shadow, darting across the far end of the hall, disappearing around the corner. I froze. It couldn't have been a guest. No one could move that fast. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back into the room and locked the door. But when I turned around, Katie was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed. "Did you hear it too?" she whispered. That was the first night, and it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, things escalated. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut without any wind, and every night, at exactly 3 a.m., we'd hear that same haunting humming. Andrew, the biggest skeptic of us all, started to crack. One night he woke us up, pale as a ghost, sweat pouring down his face. "I saw her," he stammered. "The lady in white. She was standing at the foot of my bed. Now here's where things get even stranger, and I want to know. Would you stay in a room where someone claims to have seen a ghost? Tell me in the comments." We wanted to leave. Trust me, we did. But something about that ship wouldn't let us. It was as if the Queen Mary herself was holding us captive, trapping us in some twisted nightmare. Every time we tried to pack up and leave, something would happen. Lights flickering, strange noises, doors refusing to open. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, terrifying dreams of drowning, of being trapped in the freezing waters of the Atlantic as the ship sank. We'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. But the ship remained eerily silent. One night Andrew couldn't take it anymore. He stormed out of the room, saying he was going to prove this was all just in our heads. Katie and I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He never came back. We searched the entire ship, but Andrew was gone. The staff told us no one had seen him, and after hours of searching, we were forced to call the police. They searched too. No trace of him was ever found. Katie and I were terrified. We knew we had to leave. But as we made our way toward the exit, that humming started again, only this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind us. We turned around, and there she was, the lady in white. Her eyes locked on mine, her expression cold and unfeeling. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "You're not leaving." That's when I realized we weren't the first, and we wouldn't be the last. The Queen Mary had claimed many souls before us, and she wasn't done yet. Katie and I stood frozen, unable to move. The lady in white didn't blink, didn't waver, just stood there staring at us, like she was waiting for something. Her white gown shimmered in the dim hallway light, and her face was pale and emotionless, like a mannequin brought to life. But it was her eyes that sent a shiver down my spine, cold, empty, and yet somehow aware. I grabbed Katie's arm, trying to pull her back into the room, but she wouldn't budge. Her eyes were locked on the ghostly figure, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Mark, we need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. But the lady in white? She just smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a jolt of fear through my entire body. And then just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. No sound, no warning, just gone. Katie and I didn't waste any more time. We sprinted back into the room, slamming the door behind us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. We stood there for what felt like hours, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Did you see her?" Katie gasped, her voice shaking. She was right there, Mark. I wasn't imagining it. We both saw her." I nodded, still in shock. "We need to leave," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to get off this ship, now." But getting off the Queen Mary wasn't going to be that easy. When we tried to leave our room the next morning, the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard we pulled, pushed, or kicked, it was as if the door had been welded shut overnight. Panic set in quickly. I checked the windows, but they were sealed tight too, as if the ship itself was trapping us inside. Our phones had no signal, and the landline in the room was dead. We were completely cut off from the outside world. Trapped. That's when I heard it again, the humming. It started off faint, barely noticeable, but grew louder, creeping into every corner of the room like a thick fog. Katie and I backed away from the door, our eyes wide with fear. We knew what was coming. Suddenly, the lights flickered, once, twice, and then total darkness. "Mark," Katie whispered, her voice barely audible in the pitch black. What do we do?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "Stay close. Don't move." The air around us grew colder, so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing down the hallway outside our room. They stopped right outside our door. I'll never forget what happened next, and I bet you're starting to wonder too. What would you do in our situation? Would you try to escape or stay put? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story has you hooked. There was a knock, not a hard, aggressive knock. No, it was soft, almost polite, like someone gently rapping their knuckles on the wood. But in the dead silence of the room, it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. Katie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't answer it," she whispered. I wasn't planning to. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay far, far away from that door. But then the handle started to turn, slowly, just like it had the night before. I took a step back, pulling Katie with me, as the door creaked open. But this time it wasn't the lady in white. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the flickering light from the hallway, was Andrew. I couldn't believe my eyes. Andrew, who had disappeared without a trace the night before, was standing right in front of us, looking completely unharmed. But there was something off about him. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes looked vacant, like he was staring right through us. "Andrew," Katie whispered, stepping forward. "Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere for you." Andrew didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, staring at us with that blank, empty gaze. And then in a voice that didn't sound like his own, he said, "You can't leave. She won't let you." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about, Andrew? Who won't let us leave?" But Andrew didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the room. Katie and I backed up, but again, no response. He just kept walking toward us, slow and deliberate, like he was being controlled by something or someone else. And then just as he reached us, he stopped, his head jerked to the side, his eyes widening in terror, as if he was seeing something we couldn't. "She's here," he whispered. "She's coming for you." Before we could react, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. And that's when we heard it, the sound of heavy, ragged breathing, right behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. But the breathing continued, getting louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to my ear. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see Katie, but she was standing on the other side of the room, her eyes wide with terror. I looked down at my shoulder, and there, in the dim light, was the faint outline of a handprint. Cold, wet, like someone had just pulled themselves out of the freezing Atlantic and touched me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the handprint slowly faded away. Katie screamed, and I spun around to see her backing away from Andrew, who was now grinning, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't belong on his face. "You can't escape," he said, his voice low and guttural. "She won't let you leave." And that's when we realized Andrew wasn't Andrew anymore. Andrew's grin stretched unnaturally wide, like his face wasn't made for that kind of expression. Katie and I were backed into the corner of the room, our backs pressed against the cold, unforgiving wall. The reality hit us like a freight train. Andrew, our friend, wasn't with us anymore. Whatever was standing in front of us was something else, something far more sinister. "Mark, we need to go," Katie whispered, her voice trembling. I could hear the panic rising, but there was nowhere to run. Andrew, or whatever was pretending to be him, took another step forward. His body jerked with each movement, like a puppet on strings. His eyes locked on mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of the real Andrew in there, scared, trapped, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You don't get it," he said, his voice cold and distant. "She's always been here. She's part of this ship. You can't leave, because she won't let you." Katie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she pulled me toward the door. "We can't stay here. Mark, we need to get out. Now." I nodded, trying to shake the overwhelming fear gripping my body. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but we had to move, fast. And now, here's a question for you. What would you do in this situation? Stay and fight, or run for your life? Let me know in the comments, and if this story is keeping you on edge, don't forget to hit that like button. Katie and I lunged for the door, but as soon as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. Something or someone was making sure we weren't going anywhere. Andrew, or the thing that was controlling him, laughed. A deep, unsettling laugh that echoed through the room. "You're not going anywhere. She's not done with you yet." Suddenly, the walls of the room seemed to close in on us, the air growing thick with an oppressive force. My head felt heavy and my vision blurred. Katie stumbled next to me, clutching her head as if she was being crushed by an invisible weight. "We have to fight it," she gasped, her voice strained. "Don't let it get into your head." But it was already too late. A sharp, stabbing pain shot through my skull, and I collapsed to my knees, gripping my head in agony. In the distance, I could hear that haunting melody, the humming, soft at first but growing louder, drowning out everything else. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time had no meaning anymore. When I finally opened my eyes, the room had changed. The once familiar walls of the ship had transformed into something unrecognizable, twisted, warped, like a nightmare come to life. The floors creaked beneath our feet, and the air smelled of salt water and decay. Katie was lying on the floor next to me, barely conscious, her breathing shallow. I shook her gently, trying to wake her up, but she only stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent under her breath. "Come on, Katie. We need to move," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "We can't stay here." But as I stood up, I noticed something even more terrifying. The door we had tried to escape through earlier was gone. In its place was a solid wall with no way out. We were trapped, completely and utterly trapped. The humming grew louder again, and this time I knew exactly what was coming. The lady in white, the one who had been tormenting us since we first boarded the ship. She appeared out of nowhere, gliding silently across the floor toward us. Her face was as cold and emotionless as ever. But now, I could see something else in her eyes, something darker, more menacing. She wasn't just here to haunt us. She wanted something from us. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, as she came closer and closer. Her presence filled the room, suffocating me with fear. Katie let out a soft whimper beside me, still too weak to stand. What do you want? I croaked, barely able to get the words out. Why are you doing this? The lady in white stopped just inches from me, her empty eyes locking onto mine. For a moment I thought she might answer, but instead she reached out with one long, slender hand and touched my chest. The moment her hand made contact, a flood of images filled my mind, flashes of the past, of people who had once been on this ship. I saw them, clear as day, walking the halls, laughing, enjoying their time on board. But then, one by one, they vanished, their faces twisting in terror as they were swallowed by the darkness. The lady in white had taken them, just as she was trying to take us. I stumbled back, breaking the connection. The images faded, but the overwhelming sense of dread remained. "She's not just a ghost," I whispered, turning to Katie, who was now sitting up, her eyes wide with fear. "She's something much worse." As if on cue, the room began to shake violently. The floorboards creaked and groaned, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I grabbed Katie's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We have to find a way out," I shouted over the deafening noise. Katie nodded, her face pale and determined. Together we searched the room, looking for any sign of an escape. But the ship wasn't letting us go that easily. Every door, every window, every possible exit was gone, replaced by solid, impenetrable walls. Then, as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The room fell deathly silent. "Do you hear that?" Katie whispered, her voice barely audible. I listened, straining to hear anything in the quiet, and then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the walls. Katie and I exchanged a terrified glance. "We need to get out of here," I muttered. "Now." The scratching grew louder, as if something was trying to claw its way through the walls. The sound was maddening, a relentless reminder that we weren't alone, and we never had been. I pulled Katie close, whispering, "We have to keep moving. We can't stay here." But just as I said that, the walls around us began to shift again. It wasn't just a haunted ship anymore. It felt alive, breathing, feeding on our fear. I could hear voices, faint, distant, yet familiar. They were calling out to us, warning us, or perhaps mocking us for ever thinking we could escape. Katie's hand tightened around mine as we stumbled down the narrow corridor, lit only by the dim, flickering lights. I could barely catch my breath. The ship's interior seemed to stretch endlessly, and every door we passed either led to nowhere or was locked shut. And then we saw her again. The lady in white stood at the end of the corridor, her veil flowing unnaturally, despite there being no breeze. Her hollow eyes were fixated on us, and she was no longer just an apparition. She was solid, real, far too real. My heart raced as she began to glide toward us, faster this time, her pale hands outstretched as if reaching for us. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Katie, too, stood frozen beside me, her eyes wide with terror. Then, out of nowhere, Andrew appeared again, or at least the thing pretending to be Andrew. His face was twisted with an eerie grin, his eyes dark voids. He walked casually toward us, as if everything was perfectly normal. "You can't outrun her," he said in a voice that was both his and not his. "She doesn't stop. Not for you. Not for anyone." "Why?" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear and anger. "Why are you doing this?" Andrew's head tilted to the side, his grin widening. "Because you're already dead." That sentence hit me like a ton of bricks. Dead? What was he talking about? This couldn't be real. I reached for Katie, her hand shaking in mine. "We're not dead," I said, trying to convince myself more than anyone else. "This is just a nightmare. We'll wake up." Andrew's laughter echoed through the hallway. "You've been dead since you set foot on this ship. Didn't you wonder why no one else was here? Why the world outside seemed so far away?" The lady in white was getting closer now. Katie's breaths were shallow and fast, panic taking over her every movement. "This isn't happening. It can't be happening," she muttered under her. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything felt too real to be a nightmare. But if what Andrew said was true, if we had been dead this entire time, then what were we running from? Suddenly, the lady in white stopped, mere feet away from us. She lifted her veil, and what we saw beneath it was far worse than anything we could have imagined. Her face was a twisted, grotesque mockery of a human being. Her features stretched and distorted as if time itself had warped her into something inhuman. "We're trapped," Katie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "There's no way out." I looked at Andrew one last time, hoping for some kind of explanation, some sort of escape. But his dark, empty eyes offered nothing but a void. He was right. We were already dead, and the ship, the cursed, haunted Queen Mary, was our eternal prison. The lady in white stepped forward, her hand reaching for me. I could feel the cold radiating from her, and as her fingers brushed my skin, a searing pain shot through my entire body. I screamed, but there was no one to hear, no one to save us. Katie collapsed beside me, her body writhing in pain as the lady in white's touch claimed her too. And just like that, the ship grew silent again. The lights flickered once more, and the air became still. The only sound left was the soft humming of that old familiar tune, the one that had haunted us from the beginning. As the lady in white disappeared into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the echoes of our screams, I realized the truth. We were never meant to leave the Queen Mary, because once the ship claimed you, there was no escape. And now, a final question for you. Dear viewer, do you believe in ghosts? Or is the Queen Mary's curse just a story, one that only becomes real when you step on board? Let me know in the comments below, if you dare. And don't forget, hit that like button if this story kept you on the edge of your seat.